currently Earth.
It was April 15th in the year 1865 at 7:22 a.m. that Abraham Lincoln, our nation's 16th president, continued his eternity from a bullet wound inflicted the night before by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer. The president's continuance came only 6 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his massive army at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the American Civil War. Booth, who remained in the North during the war despite his Confederate sympathies, initially plotted to capture President Lincoln and take him to Richmond, the Confederate capital. However, on March 20th in 1865, the day of the planned kidnapping, the president failed to appear at the spot where Booth and his 6 fellow conspirators lay in wait. 2 weeks later, Richmond fell to Union forces. In April, with Confederate armies near collapse across the South, Booth hatched a desperate plan to save the Confederacy. Learning that Lincoln was to attend Laura Keene's acclaimed performance in Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater on April 14th, Booth plotted the simultaneous assassination of Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William H. Seward. By murdering the president and 2 of his possible successors, Booth and his conspirators hoped to throw the U.S. government into a paralyzing disarray. On the evening of April 14th, conspirator Lewis T. Powell burst into Secretary of State Seward's home, seriously wounding him and 3 others, while George A. Atzerodt, assigned to Vice President Johnson, lost his nerve and fled. Meanwhile, just after 10 p.m., Booth entered Lincoln's private box unnoticed and shot the president with a single bullet in the back of his head. Slashing an army officer who rushed at him, Booth jumped to the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. The South is avenged. Although Booth had broken his left leg jumping from Lincoln's box, he succeeded in escaping Washington. Our nation's president, mortally wounded, was carried to a cheap lodging house opposite Ford's Theater. An hour after dawn the next morning, Abraham Lincoln continued his eternity, becoming the first president to be assassinated. His body was taken to the White House, where it lay until April 18th, at which point it was carried to the Capitol Rotunda to lay in state on a catafalque. On April 21st, Lincoln's body was taken to the railroad station and boarded on a train that conveyed it to Springfield, Illinois, his home before becoming president. Tens of thousands of Americans lined the train's railroad route and paid their respects to their fallen leader during the train's solemn progression through the North. Lincoln was buried on May 4th in 1865 at Oak Ridge Cemetery near Springfield. Booth, pursued by the Army and security forces, was finally cornered in a barn near Bowling Green, Virginia, and continued his eternity from a bullet wound as the barn was burned to the ground. Of the 8 other persons eventually charged with the conspiracy, 4 were hanged. It was April 15th in the year 1912 at 2:20 a.m. that the British ocean liner Titanic sinks into the North Atlantic Ocean, about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. The massive ship, which carried 2,200 passengers and crew, had struck an iceberg 2.5 hours before. On April 10th, the RMS Titanic, one of the largest and most luxurious ocean liners ever built, departed Southampton, England, on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was designed by the Irish shipbuilder William Peary and built in Belfast and was thought to be the world's fastest ship. It spanned 883 feet from stern to bow, and its hull was divided into 16 compartments that were presumed to be watertight. Because 4 of these compartments could be flooded without causing a critical loss of buoyancy, the Titanic was considered unsinkable. While leaving port, the ship came within a couple of feet of the steamer New York, but passed safely by, causing a general sigh of relief from the passengers massed on the Titanic's decks. On its first journey across the highly competitive Atlantic ferry route, the ship carried some 2,200 passengers and crew. After stopping at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland to pick up some final passengers, the massive vessel set out at full speed for New York City. However, just before midnight on April 14th, the RMS Titanic failed to divert its course from an iceberg and ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. These compartments filled with water and pulled down the bow of the ship. Because the Titanic's compartments were not capped at the top, water from the ruptured compartments filled each succeeding compartment, causing the bow to sink and the stern to be raised up to an almost vertical position above the water. Then the Titanic broke in half, and at about 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the stern and bow sank to the ocean floor. Because of the shortage of lifeboats and lack of satisfactory emergency procedures, more than 1,500 people went down in the sinking ship, or froze, and continued their eternity in the icy North Atlantic waters. Most of the 700 or so survivors were women and children. A number of notable American and British citizens continued their eternity in the tragedy, including the noted British journalist William Thomas Stead and heirs to the Strauss, Astor, and Guggenheim fortunes. 1 hour and 20 minutes after the Titanic went down, the Cunard liner Carpathia arrived. The survivors in the lifeboats were brought aboard, and a handful of others were pulled out of the water. It was later discovered that the Leyland liner Californian had been less than 20 miles away at the same time of the incident, but had failed to hear the Titanic's distress signals because its radio operator was off duty. Announcement of the details of the tragedy led to outrage on both sides of the Atlantic. In the disaster's aftermath, the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea was held in 1913. Rules were adopted requiring that every ship have lifeboat space for each person on board and that lifeboat drills be held. An international ice patrol was established to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. It was also required that ships maintain a 24-hour radio watch. On September 1st in 1985, a joint U.S.-French expedition located the wreck of the Titanic lying on the ocean floor at a depth of about 13,000 feet. The ship was explored by manned and unmanned submersibles, which shed new light on the details of its sinking. April 15th, 1959, Fidel Castro visits the U.S. 4 months after leading a successful revolution in Cuba, Fidel Castro visits our great nation. The visit was marked by tensions between Castro and our American government. On January 1st in 1959, Castro's revolutionary forces overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. From the beginning of the new regime in Cuba, U.S. officials worried about the bearded revolutionary. Castro's anti-American rhetoric, his stated plans to nationalize foreign properties in Cuba, and his association with a number of suspected leftists, including his second-in-command, Che Guevara, prompted American diplomats to keep a wary eye on him. Though he worried politicians, American reporters adored him. His tales of the days spent fighting a guerrilla war in Cuba, the fatigues and the combat boots he favored, and his bushy beard cut a striking figure. In April of 1959, Castro accepted an invitation from the American Society of Newspaper Editors to visit the U.S. The trip got off to an inauspicious start when it became clear that President Dwight D. Eisenhower, our nation's 34th president, had no intention of meeting with Castro. Instead, Eisenhower went to golf. He went to the golf course to avoid any chance of meeting with Castro. Castro gave a talk to the Council on Foreign Affairs, a New York-based group of private citizens and former government officials interested in U.S. international relations. Castro was confrontational during the session, indicating that Cuba would not beg the U.S. for economic assistance. Angered by some of the questions from the audience, Castro abruptly left the meeting. Finally, before departing for Cuba, Castro met with Vice President Richard Nixon. Privately, Nixon hoped that his talk would push Castro in the right direction and away from any radical policies. But he came away from his discussion full of doubt about the possibility of reorientating Castro's thinking. Nixon concluded that Castro was, quote, either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline. My guess is the former, unquote. Relations between the U.S. and Castro deteriorated rapidly following the April visit. In less than a year, President Eisenhower ordered the CIA to begin arming and training a group of Cuban exiles to attack Cuba. The disastrous attack, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, was eventually carried out during the Kennedy administration. The heated Cold War animosity between America and Cuba would last for over 50 years.
The information documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.